Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Felder. I am a core research faculty in the Osher Center for Integrative Health, and I co-lead these monthly research seminars with Ariana. I am so delighted to welcome Dr. Cassandra Vieten and Dr. Nicole Bush to our monthly research seminar. They'll be speaking about the trailblazing MAMAS and SEED studies, which reveal the ways in which a mindfulness intervention delivered during pregnancy can have long-term benefits, not just for mothers, but for their children as well. Dr. Vieten is the acting director of the Center for Mindfulness and associate research scientist and director of research at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at UC San Diego. Her research focuses on mindfulness-based interventions, spirituality and mental health, imagination, psychedelics, and development of media technologies to inspire awe. She's currently working on a project to bring integrative wellness programs to law enforcement personnel throughout California. She's the author of 3 books, including one that teaches mindfulness skills to women during pregnancy and early parenting. Dr. Bush is a distinguished professor of developmental and behavioral health, appointed in the departments of pediatrics and psychiatry, and division chief of the Division of Developmental Medicine at UCSF. She's an international leader with research expertise in the social determinants of child and family health and well-being. She leads or co-leads a broad range of epidemiological and clinical intervention longitudinal cohort studies focused on maternal child health, etiology, and mechanisms for social and chemical environmental effects on pediatric disease, and identifying family and policy level solutions to address health disparities across the life course. It's especially exciting for me to introduce Dr. Vieten and Dr. Bush, as their research on the MAMAS and SEED studies were what drew me to pursue postdoc training at UCSF 8 years ago, and their work has been hugely influential for me personally. So with that, I will turn it over to Cassie now.
Great. It's wonderful to see everybody. Welcome. And so good to see some new and old faces, people I've known for quite a long time and people who are new to me. So super great to be here. Let's see. As of April 1st, I'm actually the director of the Center for Mindfulness at the University of California, San Diego, and a clinical professor in the Department of Family Medicine. Still doing, directing the research program at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. But over the last decade, Nikki and I have been involved in a very large study that was funded primarily by an NIH U01 collaborative grant mechanism, as well as the Pritzkers. And I think some other funding probably helped us out here and there as well. And this has been such an incredible blessing in my life. This is one of those career projects that you feel like when I retire, when I get close to winding down this lifetime, I will be always happy that I did that project. And so it's just been wonderful. It's been a collaboration of even more people than are on this slide. But in particular, want to acknowledge Alyssa Epple, Barbara Laraya, and Nancy Adler, who were the PIs on the project. For the MAMAS project, and of course, Nikki is the PI on the SEED project, as well as all the people who have inspired the curriculum that we put together. Laurel Mellon, Jean Christeller were co-developers, and then even inspiration from Zindel Siegel, John Kabat-Zinn, Nancy Bardicke, multiple other people, initial work that we're kind of standing on the shoulders of. Most of you here are going to know what mindfulness is, but just in case you're new to mindfulness, it sounds so simple, just paying attention on purpose in a particular way, moment to moment, non-judgmental awareness of your experience as it arises, minute by minute, without judgment, and even meeting things as they are with curiosity and compassion, with kindness. And so it turns out that sitting or walking in this way, and with our women, sometimes nursing, giving birth, folding laundry, is a very powerful practice. Most people sit while they're paying attention to their breathing at first. And so it's just watching breathing and as it's moving in and out. And there's something about watching this typically automatic process that seems to allow people to gain a little bit of space from a lot of their other automatic processes, like reacting or eating or fight, flight, or freeze, other kinds of addictions, which my background has been in as well. And so this practice can then move to body sensations where we're aware of what's happening in our body. Again, those are typically under the level of our conscious awareness, but also bringing attention to things like pain or things that intrude into our conscious awareness or negative thinking patterns. And by becoming more aware of them and learning to observe them, one of the mechanisms is sort of like exposure with response prevention. You're just learning to breathe through whatever moments may arise without panicking, without reacting immediately, observing them, letting yourself have whatever feelings that you have. And this seems to reduce stress. And so there are now, probably 8,000 or more articles looking at the benefits of mindfulness, less depression, greater resilience, better relationships, less rumination, better emotion regulation. Interestingly, though, also physical, measurable, physiological, objective outcomes, improved immunity, reduced inflammation, lower blood pressure, less pain, changes in the structure and function of the brain, and even may affect telomeres and telomerase, which affect aging of cells, in various arenas of life, at work and home. And in this case, we became really interested in it around parenting. Now, I want you to know, over this decade, things have changed a lot in the culture. In 2012, about 4% of the general population reported using meditation in their lives. And by 2017, that increased to almost 15%, and it's probably more now. But when we started this, it was still kind of a weird thing, And of course, John Kabat-Zinn brought mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was this secularized version of meditation, initially for pain patients, and then for other kinds of disorders and illnesses and conditions, and also for thriving and growth. And now there have been tons and tons of different adaptations. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is the one that the Mindful Motherhood program was primarily based on. MBE, eating disorders, relapse prevention, childbirth, parenting, all kinds of different things, and as well as affecting, including itself in some forms of therapy and different populations. And so it's become very big. There's an ever expanding target audience. And for me, it was really, I was doing a lot of mindfulness work with people who were recovering from addictions and substance abuse, substance disorders. And then I became pregnant and I had a strong mindfulness practice at the time. And I found that it really, really helped me during my pregnancy, during childbirth, postpartum. And as many researchers do, I got super excited about something that I personally experienced and wanted to know, could this possibly help other people? So we did a study where we developed an intervention, a mindfulness-based intervention for pregnancy and postpartum, really focused on, number one, a very 101 level, like we were teaching this in hospital lobbies. It was 1.5 hours instead of the typical 3-hour MBSR. It didn't have a retreat. It was very much an introductory level of mindfulness. And we refined it over 5 groups of women at California Pacific Medical Center. I did this work with John Aston. And that resulted in the book Mindful Motherhood, which is really for patients. The study design was that we recruited our participants, we assessed them, we randomized them into groups where they either got the treatment or treatment as usual, and the treatment as usual was actually a waitlist control. We did the prenatal group training. We assessed the participants prior to childbirth. We did a 3-month assessment, including mom-baby interactions. And then we trained the postpartum group, which was the waitlist control, but it ended up being such an amazing experience to teach mindfulness with the women, with the babies in the room. The intervention was a couple hours a week, I guess, breath and body awareness, mindful movement, observing, noticing, naming, noting, non-judgment, dealing with thinking patterns, being present, practicing radical acceptance and mindful action, self-compassion, and everyday mindfulness, which is really important for this group. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The way that this intervention was adapted, I mentioned Nancy Bardacke, who had this mindfulness and childbirth pregnancy preparation that was for couples. It was very MBSR based. It was 3 hours a week with a long retreat. And this was more for people who maybe didn't have a partner, had super high stress, had very high risk for postpartum depression, and inner city diverse women who had quite a bit of difficulty even making it to the interventions often. The baby and the mom were included in all guided practices even before they were born, so the fetus. There were more moving and partnered mindfulness because it's not that easy for pregnant women to sit still. And we wanted them to have, we actually wanted to boost the social support as opposed to trying to section it out. The baby was explicitly included in metta and loving kindness practice because we were trying to affect mother-infant bonding. All instructions for one's own experience were also directed towards responses to the baby's experience. And postpartum sessions provided what we call on-the-job training, where the baby would start crying, and instead of having someone take them out of the room, we would say, no, let's all practice mindfulness right now while the baby's crying, while we're holding the baby. We also offered centering prayer as an option for meditation practice because a lot of the women were Latina and African American and were very religious. And so sometimes centering prayer was a way to practice mindfulness that didn't seem like it was against their current tradition. And so I don't expect you to look at all of this other than the right-hand column with the effect sizes. With a fairly small group, we had pretty high level effect sizes on anxiety, depression, negative affect, and improving positive affect. And even for the ones that didn't reach significance, it was all going in the right direction, as you can see. So this was really pilot intervention development feasibility study. Here's some of the women who were meditating with their babies. This was in the big synagogue over by California Pacific Medical Center. And I think it's important to say that this kind of mindfulness is not transcendent mindfulness where everybody's sitting very, very quietly and bells are ringing. This is kind of a down and dirty embodied mindfulness. It's a full and intimate engagement with experience. We would say the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, because we're talking about a lot of poop and vomit and saliva. And I mean, everything you can imagine is happening, 2 hours of crying, croup, you know, all of this stuff. And so the mindfulness practice wasn't so much about getting away from all that so you could practice. It was more practicing with it, through it, and really, really wonderful. So lovely to have these women. And I think one of the great experiences is sitting in the room, and we thought it was going to be an utter madhouse. But what we found is when the group started sitting in mindfulness practice, the babies would all be laying on the blankets in the middle of the room, and there would be this little symphony of baby noises while everyone was practicing mindfulness, which was wonderful. So I was so honored to have Alyssa Epple and Barbara Laraya and Nancy Adler ask if we could adapt the Mindful Motherhood program to this U01 mechanism, this 5-year grant, the Maternal Adiposity, Metabolism and Stress, or MAMAS study, which was targeting obesity. It was part of this orbit mechanism where there were 16 investigative teams funded by the NIH to try to reduce the obesity epidemic. And we were the only ones focused on pregnancy. There were lots of other ones as well. But there was also this model for iterative behavioral treatment development featuring a flexive and progressive process and having these clinically significant milestones for forward movement, and then a return to earlier stages for refinement and optimization. So they were really trying to pay attention to intervention development. So having said that, you should know that the intervention changed slightly with every wave. We had 215 women, 47% met criteria for obesity, the others were overweight. They were recruited between 12 and 24 weeks gestation, one child, not twins, without diabetes or other conditions already affecting metabolism, predominantly women of color, low to middle income, 33% were single parents, and they were assigned to either the intervention or the treatment as usual group. And so we were really looking at year one in choosing the exact correct intervention, refining it in years 1 through 4, and then doing a trial between treatment as usual and the intervention. So our model was similar to mindful motherhood, except that we included a lot of attention to movement and obviously mindful eating behaviors, as well as nutritional recommendations. Our model of change was that we hoped that the training would increase mindfulness, reduce stress, and improve eating behaviors, resulting in healthier gestational weight gain, reduced maternal complications, and reduced offspring risk of obesity, in addition to reduced distress. And so the intervention itself looked like nutritional and eating behavior. We really tried to make it simple: what to eat, how much to eat, and how and when to eat. Things like replacing certain types of food with food that was healthier, looking at portion sizes using, how about portions the size of your fist? Also, how and when to eat, not mindlessly eating a bag of chips in front of the TV, but putting it into a bowl and eating it mindfully. A lot of this comes from Jean Christeller's work, mindful versus mindless eating, trying to become aware of taste and satiety cues, being aware of emotional eating. And then we did all of the basic stress reduction plus that adaptation for pregnancy that we had put together before. So when we talked to the women, we actually had this mantra: mindful eating, move my body, breathe. Mindful eating, move my body, breathe. And this was a card that they carried around in their wallets. We gave them swag, things that had like water bottles with mindful eating, move my body, breathe. And that was what they needed to remember. If you want the treatment manual, you can find it here. And you can also go to the AME website at UCSF Center Health Psychology. And so now we're talking about the U01 trial with the 215 women. These data are just going to show you pre and post intervention, that what we were doing was having the intended effect on mindfulness and on emotion regulation, mindful eating, at least self-reported, psychological flexibility, depression, and anxiety. So that was great because that was actually our mechanism. It ended up being more of the outcome, as you'll find out in a minute. We also were able to show the correlations between increased mindfulness and increased emotion regulation, with some measures of the change in depression, the change in perceived stress, and the change in emotional eating. You'll still see here that the perceived stress and depression were much stronger than the actual effect on eating, but there were some things that were affecting the eating style. So that was great. This is just a little bit more boiled down. And this is perceived stress and depression, just to kind of outline that the blue group is the treatment as usual, the red group is the mindfulness intervention, and we just showed some nice clinically significant effects on distress. Jennifer Felder, who's our host today, also did a super awesome study showing that the people who got the mindfulness training, usually when you have impaired sleep, it'll cause depression and stress in your life. And for the people who did not get the mindfulness intervention, that was true. For the people who did get the mindfulness intervention, it actually attenuated the relationship between poor sleep and stress. So we like to think that there was some buffer happening there. In terms of our primary outcome, we did not find changes in obesity, in weight, but what we did find was glucose metabolism, improvement in glucose control. So that's a super interesting finding that should be followed up further. And maybe, I think, number one, it may just not work on weight. But number two, there may be so many things going into weight as the primary outcome, especially when there's huge fluctuations from day to day with pregnant women and postpartum women, that it just might not be the right outcome to be thinking about right now. And of course, there's a movement in society right now too, to kind of move away from size and BMI into looking at more functional measures. So here were some of our graduates, and also want to really acknowledge our facilitators. This is Hukma Joy Allen on the upper left, and Shahara Godfrey, who's actually late and passed away recently, and all of our amazing women. And so I'm going to pass it over to Nikki here, who has the really, really exciting news. But definitely get in touch with me at the Center for Mindfulness at UCSD if you'd like to, and I will pass it over to the fabulous Nikki at this point. And no, I can't find the screen either.
I
Nick.
know, it keeps disappearing on us.
That's so funny.
Take your time.
Well, maybe somebody can help me stop sharing. There we go. All right.
Thank you. Okay, well, let me get this set up. Are you guys seeing the version you should? Great.
No, I think you need to swap display.
Now it's
there you go.
the way I thought it would be. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
So it's such a privilege to be able to share this after Cassie gives that context and that rich description of the background of the intervention. And I get to talk a little bit more about what happened after the babies were born, both for the women and the children. And I'm really excited to do that. Some of you guys may be familiar with some of these concepts I'm about to present, but I want to give a little bit of background. So taking a step back from MAMAS and just thinking more broadly around intergenerational transmission of health. And I think increasingly we're starting to understand that experiences that happen early in our life can have get under the skin or program our bodies in ways that affect our later health. That wasn't as commonly known. Like Cassie said, mindfulness wasn't so common back when we started this work, and neither was that concept around biological embedding of early life stress. So that has become more common, but that was one of the things I got really interested in as a postdoc when I was around the folks starting the MAMAS pilot. But I think what was less well known then and still is being absorbed by society today is that it's not just early childhood, but it's factors that happen in utero that can affect the programming of that individual and their development over time. And that actually understanding that intergenerational transmission is pretty critical to understanding population health and individual well-being. Some of the theories that describe this are called developmental origins of health and disease. And this talks about how the intrauterine environment actually provides critical information about stress, nutrition, taste, toxins to the developing fetus. And that's important because we need that fetus to be able to calibrate its development to optimize survival in the environment it's about to be born into. So is it 100-degree heat? Is it incredibly cold? Is there lots of spicy food? Is there high protein, low protein, et cetera? Is there a lot of tigers around, so they need a really strong fight or flight response, or can they conserve some of that energy and direct it towards other developmental outcomes that might be more adaptive? And so those are decisions that the fetus makes in response to information that crosses through the placenta, and that's critical for development. So we want that. However, sometimes chronic diseases can arise, such as obesity, when there's a mismatch between the world the baby was programmed for and the real world, or alternatively, when a baby's programmed to survive to puberty and procreation, but maybe that has consequences for long-term health and disease. So it's within that framework that folks have started to think a lot more about the developmental origins of pathology, whether it be mental health or physical health, and frankly, they're quite interrelated. This is a beautiful review I like to refer to that does a really nice job talking about some of the social factors in pregnancy, whether they be intrapersonal or interpersonal, as well as the large macro socio-environmental factors that play a role during pregnancy in the development of later mental health. However, as you'll see, I also focus quite a bit on physical health outcomes in kids. This paper also does a nice job outlining some of the ways in which that transmission might occur with a lot of data from animal studies experimentally showing us that this is the case, but a lot of human data suggesting that we are seeing that in human processes as well. And at the time that I did this work, I was a postdoc, as I said, and I got really excited about this. The field was pretty nascent. There was a bunch of European studies with predominantly middle to upper class European women. And we didn't know very much about causation. It was a lot of correlational data. So I was excited to leverage this MAMAS design to kind of understand how would this reduction in pregnancy relate to postnatal maternal outcomes, but also help us infer some causality around stress and weight gain and metabolic factors in pregnancy and infant phenotypes that are relevant for all sorts of health and disease outcome. But also, what if intervention doesn't work? Can we still identify protective factors that might help us understand who can be buffered and how to buffer women and children from prenatal stress? I also was interested in early phenotypes. Let's not wait until we see disease. Let's understand some of these RDoC NIH theme things, but things that any developmentalist knows are important to understand that occur early in life before we have a bunch of diagnoses that give us a signal that children are not developing optimally. And then really importantly, there was very limited work on communities of color, low-income communities, or those experiencing high stress. And so it was really important to jump on this train that I saw was so exciting, with such an incredibly inspiring group of people leading the work, to try to unpack some of these questions in the offspring. So I was funded to do an R01 to examine exactly that. And I'm highlighting Nancy Adler and Alyssa Apple on this slide because they were such incredible mentors to me in helping me do this right out of postdoc, and really enabled both me getting funded and launching this project with support to do pilot data collection, et cetera. We also added infectious illness after I got some additional funds because it was clear that that was a really big part of the story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the SEED study to give you a sense of what we learned. So the MAMAS sample had a lot of stress and trauma. So this is the PRAMS, prenatal stressful life events scale, and it gives you a sense of how many different types of events, not the times these things happen, but whether it happened at all during their pregnancy. And as you can see, there's a lot of stressful experiences in this community and population. And we have a big range here, but on average, women in this subsample experienced a mean of almost 3 events, and about 50% of them had 3 or more. So this is a community experiencing a lot of adversity during their pregnancy. And so they had a lot of things we wanted to pay attention to. Indeed, we found that prenatal stress during pregnancy was associated with increased stress response in the offspring at 6 months of age. And this is a marker of respiratory sinus arrhythmia and the reactivity in those babies in response to a challenge, and a reduction in parasympathetic suggests a stress response in those offspring. And so we saw more stress during pregnancy was greater reactivity in those infants. We also, in a paper led by Jennifer Felder, found that stress during pregnancy was associated with rapid infant weight gain. And the reason this matters is rapid infant weight gain is not only potentially a problem for those babies, but it places them at much greater risk for obesity in childhood and later adulthood. And remarkably, we found that for each additional type of event exposed during pregnancy, there was a 40% greater odds of rapid infant weight gain. So that's a pretty powerful effect or association. And it was really important that we found that work. It hadn't been published before. We also did medical records abstraction to get a really objective rating of illness. And strikingly, we found that greater stress in pregnancy was associated with infants being more ill across the first year of life. They showed greater risks of infectious illness as well as non-infectious illness. And notably, they had a greater diversity of illness. So it wasn't just, oh, you have 4 ear infections. They had many types of problems. And so it really was the first data that we had found, particularly in the United States, with objective measures to show that this was associated with illness. But that bad news was not why I got the R01. It was just to demonstrate that this was a population we needed to understand buffers and resilience within. And so we published those papers, and as soon as we could, moved on to looking at postnatal outcomes in those moms and their babies. And so again, Jennifer Felder, Danielle Rubinoff, and others on our team were able to lead a beautiful paper looking through 18 months postpartum at maternal outcomes. And what we found is when you do latent class analysis to understand the different heterogeneity in women's experiences and reports of depression post-intervention during pregnancy through 18 months postpartum, you found these 3 different classes, which are commonly found in community samples. But notably, this moderate class, which is moderate or higher depression symptoms, the treatment as usual group were almost 8 times more likely to be in that moderate or high depression class. And so this really suggested not only an immediate effect that Cassie highlighted during pregnancy, but a sustained differential in depression outcomes for these women, and a pretty powerful effect. Now, keep these latent class groups in mind. Danielle Rubinoff, who was a postdoc with me at the time, looked at healthcare utilization for the infants. So remember, those infants were more sick. Infants associated with stress during pregnancy had greater sickness. But what we found is if you look at those depression classes, there was an interaction between whether or not you belong to a certain class of depression postnatally and intervention group participation, such that on average, babies are expected to go to the doctor for 8 well child visits in their first year of life. And so that's that red line here. You would expect at least 8 visits if they're adhering to the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations for well-child visits. We find that on average, the number of times babies went to the pediatrician in the first year of life is higher for those women in the moderate to severe class. But this is very different depending on whether or not you had attended the intervention. So treatment as usual had an additional 6 visits per year. So some women in the mindfulness group were in the moderate depression class. However, it was not associated with increases in health-seeking behaviors for their infant. And sometimes that can be to care for mom's needs, and sometimes it can be for the kids when they go see the pediatrician. So lots of interesting, exciting potential here for this relating to utilization in addition to illness. More recently, we were able to follow this population through age 8. And you see the results that Cassie shared with you on the left here, which is that immediate during pregnancy evidence for reduction in depression. And we published that initially and then found the latent class findings for 18 months. And when we followed these women through age 8, we were just in awe and thrilled to see that we had this sustained differential in depression across early childhood related to participation in the mindfulness group. And what was really striking is these are clinically significant differences. There was more than double the amount of women in the moderate to severe depression cutoff. And even more striking is we did an assessment during the pandemic when the children were 8 years of age. And although there was, consistent with the general population, an uptick in depression symptomatology, the difference was maintained. So we were struck with the longevity of this impact on outcomes for these women, but that even in the face of a really challenging and high stress circumstance, particularly for caregivers during the pandemic, we still saw this buffering in relation to participation in the intervention. So this has been a really thrilling paper for all of us. But was there a 2-generation impact? You can make some assumptions because moms are doing better, the kids probably are too, but we wanted to use some very objective measures of the offspring to unpack some of that. So here's my favorite picture of the women in one of the groups and their babies. And what we did is we reached out to those women just prior to the birth to let them know we were thinking about following them once they had their babies. And then after their births, we contacted them and encouraged them to enroll in the SEED study. And they often had a reunion class just after the babies were born to meet each other's babies. And that was one of the places we always tried to catch them to. We were thrilled that 180 mother-child dyads did enroll in our offspring follow-up study. The demographics are quite similar to the original 215 that Cassie described earlier. Our population looked relatively healthy in terms of birth weight and gestational age, not as high as you would expect given the stressors they had been exposed to, but again, we did exclude based on major pregnancy complications at enrollment. And so that explains some of the kind of relatively typical levels there. We use gold standard paradigms and experimental paradigms to try to unpack stress reactivity and regulation and health in these babies. Some of you guys might have heard of the still face paradigm. I'll explain it to you for just a minute. When babies were 6 months of age, they completed this research visit. And on the left side, you see a mom playing and engaging with her child in a fun way. They were encouraged to spend 2 minutes engaging in play. And we didn't say make it positive, but most moms went on camera in front of a bunch of people, try to be as amazing as they possibly can. And they end up having a lot of fun with their babies most of the time. And then we ask them, when we say a little word, still, we ask them to hold a still, neutral, expressionless face, regardless of what the baby does. Happy, sad, kicking, screaming. We ask them to stare right at the baby's forehead and do not respond to the best of their ability. And they hold that for 2 minutes. And as you might imagine, a baby is programmed to get a response from their caregiver. And at that age, the response from the caregiver is critical to their survival and emotional development. And so they get very upset and try very hard to get mom to respond. And then after the 2 minutes, we say resume. And so they can play again and the kids recover and mom says, I'm so sorry, and they have a lovely 2-minute exchange. And it's a really important, well-validated paradigm to understand both parenting, individual reactivity and regulation, and the relationship between the dyad. And we were really interested in that infant biobehavioral markers of health. And in particular, we hooked up these 6-month-olds to EKGs. This is a picture of my toddler, a little older than the participants in question here, but wanted to use a familiar person's body for the public presentation. We hooked him up to 7 EKGs so we could get an assessment of their parasympathetic reactivity and regulation. And we assessed this via respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And this is a naturally occurring variation in heart rate as a function of respiration. And when you see a decrease in that, that's a withdrawal of the parasympathetic activation. And so that usually reflects either a stress response or an orienting or a tension response. So they're kind of paying attention and perhaps needing to react. It's also referred to as the rest and digest system. And then we also assessed pre-ejection period or sympathetic nervous system activity and regulation. And this is the fight or flight system. And we looked at the interval representing the duration from the beginning of the stimulation until the ejection of blood. And so a shortening of that is a stress response. You're getting ready to fight or flee. We also did behavioral coding. So people who were masked to group participation did second by second coding. I have highlighted Karen Jones-Mason in the lower right, who is a hero and led the coding paradigm on our team for a long, long time. You imagine doing second by second coding on 180 kids, and reliability and validity, having double coded majority of those tapes. And we coded negative protests, which is things such as anger, grimaces, fussing, crying, arching backs, etc. Negative withdrawal, which is related to not engaging with the caregiver, whimpering, vocalization, slumping, etc. We also measured regulatory behavior. And for an infant, this can include looking at objects, staring at the wall, their hands, or self-soothing, such as hand sucking. And it's thought to be quite adaptive and a marker of self-regulation, has been validated as being such in many other studies. And we looked at the MAMAS intervention group differences on those 6-month outcomes. And first, I want to state that both of these paradigm outcomes worked very well. On average, over the course of this experiment, we saw lots of stress reactivity and regulation, so we had good variability. And we used linear mixed effects modeling to help us look at these group differences in a repeated measures framework. So these data show you one of the autonomic nervous system markers that we measured. This is the parasympathetic marker. We scored in 30-second epochs, so that's what those little lines are suggesting there. And what I didn't tell you is we didn't just do play, still face, and reunion. We added a second still face, and that's because the data suggests that it's that second one that really gets most kids. The first one, about half the kids really respond. That second one, most kids do. So we really wanted to activate stress response in a ethical way. And what you see here is a relatively flat line during play, a reduction in parasympathetic activity during the stressor, recovery during the first reunion, a greater reduction during the second still face, and near recovery during the second reunion. So we do get them back to normal, and most kids on average do recover, although there is a lot of variability. This is a piano plot of the second by second behavior coding of the infant, negative behavior and object engagement. And what you can see here is each row is a participant. And I want to highlight Michael Kosia, who has been one of my partners in this work for I think 8 years now, and is an incredible statistician and also visual informatics person who helps us do these kind of complex data analyses. But what you see here is each row is a participant, and the red is negative distress. And you'll note that the top is the kids who dropped out, either because mom said, okay, we want to stop this, or the researcher said, your kid's pretty dysregulated and we'd like to stop that. So we would try to be very compassionate and determine whether or not that infant was in a safe place to continue. And what you see is during the play, you see a majority of social or object engagement. And during the still, you see a lot more negative behavior and a lot more object engagement, which is, again, an indicator of regulation. And those high degree of red at the top are the kids who dropped out because they were just too distressed. But you see this worked very well as expected. And indeed, that second still face had a lot more negative energy coming out of it. And we were really struck to find that in this group differences test, we found that the mindfulness children displayed a reduction in PEP, or a fight or flight response to the challenge. And that is an appropriate response to challenge. Whereas there was not a change that was significant in the treatment as usual group. When we went to the reunion, that is when the treatment as usual kids showed a fight or flight response. So they showed a similar response to the challenge, but at a timing that is considered kind of inappropriate for that response. That was when they should have been recovering and getting back to baseline, and instead it happened in a delayed manner. For our mindfulness babies, when you looked at baseline play and reunion recovery period, in the end, they fully recovered. There was no difference between baseline and end in that sympathetic arousal, whereas for the treatment as usual group, they did not fully recover. So you see both a delayed reaction and a lack of recovery in the treatment as usual group. Looking at the parasympathetic indicators, we saw a similar type of difference, although it didn't reach statistical significance because there's so much variability, in particular in that mind group. You see really large error bars there. There was a lot of heterogeneity in response across this challenge, which prevented us from having significant differences. And this, to us, suggests that that fight or flight response, which is much more associated with threat and challenge, was the one that was most saliently predicted by mindfulness participation in pregnancy, although there is still a signal here. Looking at the coding, we found regulation differences in that emotional coding, especially in those later periods where regulation is most important after all the stressors. And in the negativity, trend level differences over time, although there wasn't quite as much negativity in the beginning, so it was hard to pick up those effects. So in summary, participation in this mindfulness intervention during pregnancy is associated with group level differences in fight or flight response, as well as self-regulatory objective coded behavior. And Amanda Nora-Nizu, my partner and wonderful teammate, led this work that is just published last year. We also have work looking in early childhood showing that differences in depression in moms and early internalizing symptoms in babies, when you hold all those things constant over time, knowing that they're intercorrelated and stable across individuals to some degree, we find a pretty powerful prediction of early childhood maternal depression during toddlerhood and child internalizing later, suggesting that those differences in depression in the MAMAS group are probably playing a meaningful role in the child mental health outcomes over time, although we haven't gotten to those t-test papers just yet. So in conclusion, our findings suggest this short-term, beautiful intervention that's psychosocial by nature, reduce stress, improve physical activity, and lower diabetes risk, but it can also result in sustained 8-year benefits for the women and biobehavioral phenotype differences that may have a role in psychopathology and health for their children. So we argue that this suggests these behavioral interventions in pregnancy can benefit 2 generations. But before I wrap up, I just want to highlight the beauty of this is that it targets the caregiver and in particular the pregnant woman, but we have to be very careful because so many of the things that these women are exposed to are so out of their control and our society's responsibility to prevent and address in the first place. So although I love to provide women with tools to deal with the stress in their lives, it's actually incredibly important that our programs and policies are doing something to reduce it in the first place. We have to prevent the violence, address the income gaps, the housing deficits, the racism, sexism, et cetera, in order to prevent the need for all of this mindful regulation. And then we also need to do prevention programs that will have non-stigmatizing things such as wellness classes, wellness promotion. We need regular screening for mental health with appropriate referrals and a workforce that can meet the need. And we need to get rid of medical necessity. So mental health services should be something we can access without a diagnosis. Home visiting programs, all sorts of things are important here that don't place the onus on the moms to reduce their reactivity to all the things going on in the world and the deficits they're facing. I'll just highlight a couple things in California before I end here. There's some really cool things that are aligned with these goals, things like the California Momnibus Act, which is a fund to grow the diversity of the midwife workforce and extend Medicaid eligibility for moms from 2 to 12 months postpartum. There's the Abundant Birth Project here in San Francisco, which is an unconditional monthly income transfer of $1,000 to Black and Pacific Islander women, birthing women in San Francisco for the duration of their pregnancy and the first 6 months of their baby's life. And this is a partnership with the Preterm Birth Initiative at UCSF. And of course, there's increased federal attention to these issues, although it's never enough, but we were really grateful when Vice President Harris came to visit us at UCSF to bring some attention to these. And so Cassie had shown the link to the MAMAS manual, QR code on the left if you want to hold your phone up to that and look that up. But also, as she mentioned, there's a link to the MAMAS and Seeds publication on Alyssa Eppel's AME website, which can tell you a lot more about all the papers that are both in MAMAS and SEED with or without intervention effects if you're interested in that. And our team is large and diverse, people from all different walks of life and profession, and a huge gratitude to especially those younger people on the lower line who collected these data for the last 10 years. And our funders, as Cassie noted, there are many, and they come from all different arenas to get this type of complex work done. So thank you. And sorry, I ran over, folks.
Fantastic talk, you two. Thank you so much. And we have lots of great questions. I'm going to start with one of mine. So oh,
never mind. I found it. Go ahead.
The finding that the intervention was associated with improved depression outcomes 8 years postpartum is so striking. And I'm curious, do you either have any data, and if not, any theories about why? Is it that simply the short-term prenatal intervention had these sort of long-term benefits, or did it set into effect sort of like a cascade of mental health behaviors that might have prevented depression sort of like more long-term?
Yeah, Nikki and I, well, we were just talking about this yesterday, that this is the key question. And even though this was a super complex study that has tons and tons of results, it still was an intervention development trial. And we were not actually mandated, or like our charter wasn't to do an efficacy trial, even though we did include this randomized, this trial. So the next steps are really going to be to try to nail down mechanism and try to nail down efficacy with a randomized sample. Having said that, there are so many possible theories. One is that it really affected rumination as one potential psychological mechanism, or increased emotion regulation in a way that just was lasting. It also could have, as you know, Jennifer, impacted something like sleep, or the relationship between sleep and stress, which is such a huge deal. It could have given them more social support. I mean, it's possible still that it wasn't even mindfulness, right? So we need to keep that in mind. It could be that it got passed down to the babies in the short term. And so the women were dealing with less distressed babies, which then caused less depression. So there's so many possible options.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think they're all likely to some degree, and it may be a lot of heterogeneity for whom, which pathway was the driver. I think we had this moment, my R01, we tried to downplay the intervention because I wrote it when we didn't know if it was effective. And so I didn't want my R01 to sink if it was not. And so it was a relatively minor piece of it. And the goal was not ever to understand mechanisms for intervention effects on the mothers. And so my design kind of missed that. And so Alyssa and Danielle and I just went back into the field remotely in the last 6 months, trying to get some measurements of mindfulness and eating behaviors and weight on these women to say, hey, we saw these incredible effects in your well-being. Can we try to understand why? And so we're in the midst of collecting those data now. It's a little late for us to have done that, but we're glad for the chance. And I think there's teams of us who are trying to think about how we redo this study and think more and pay more attention to that so we can capture those.
Great, thank you. There are a couple questions about objective measures. So were the newborns of stressed moms evaluated with more objective measurements like APGAR scores, blood levels of stress hormone, cortisol, etc.?
So first, I would argue that everything I showed was an objective measure. So sympathetic nervous system reactivity to a standardized protocol, parasympathetic nervous system, and objective coding that was masked to group participation are all objective measures. So I would say the answer is yes. APGAR scores tend to reflect more of the birth experience than the pregnancy experience. And so we did consider that initially, but the data weren't super compelling that that's a great outcome. And there's so much heterogeneity in coding for APGAR. So we wanted a much more rigorous kind of standardized objective measure. So I would say yes. And that's why I think the effects are so powerful. It's not mom report who might be biased by semantics that she learned in an intervention class, but it's actual biological and behavioral measures coded by others.
Great, thank you. Well, and then maybe sort of related to that, whether so the intervention was associated with a decrease in perceived stress. What about biomarkers of stress like cortisol? Did you see significant changes in those?
In the mothers?
In the mothers.
Yeah, so I think Alyssa and team ran several of those analyses initially. It's pretty complicated during pregnancy to assess those things, and they had hoped to do a measure of placental CRH, which is an indicator that can be associated with stress exposure and also has a lot to do with birth timing and the development of the fetus. Unfortunately, despite the tens of thousands of dollars spent on that assay, the results didn't have enough variability to run those tests. And that was before hair cortisol was popularized too. So that would have been a good measure in pregnancy, but that was just kind of early days at the time. So these data are pretty old. The kids are now 10 and 11 years old. And so some of these things that were done in pregnancy, everyone would say, oh, you have to do this now, but it wasn't really on the market at the time. So we don't have biological changes in the women that are significant. But again, those
except for the glucose,
the metabolic
metabolism.
ones, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Right. Okay. And well, maybe a segue from that is, do you have any data or plan to collect data on the kids' metabolic health? Wondering if any of the kids' outcomes were related to the glucose control changes that you reported.
So the rapid infant weight gain is a metabolic outcome to some degree. We didn't get blood on the kids. It's pretty tough to get blood in a longitudinal study of kids. People just don't want to have their children have a blood draw, and that's necessary for most of those measures, although we do have BMI across childhood. And so I think ideally, one of the things we're trying to do is figure out what other measures have we not looked at yet. We've been so focused on getting these early findings out, and the funding's long over. So that's also part of it. We don't have tons of postdocs assigned to this with lots of time. Alyssa put a note in the chat. Postdoc Ryan Brown is examining some of these things in terms of OGTT, predicting outcomes for moms and infants. So some of this stuff is revived with new energy and junior scholars with lots of fresh knowledge and energy. And so hopefully we'll have a lot more to show soon.
Great, thank you. Maytal, who is a postdoc at the Osher Center, asks, did you find any difference in outcomes depending on the type and timing of stressor? So I think referring to the really striking results you presented in terms of just how many stressful life events women reported experiencing during pregnancy.
We haven't looked at that yet. We just got these initial group differences out, and so we haven't looked at effect modifiers of the intervention effect. I think that's our plan for later time points too. So when that big main effect, well, I don't know how big it is, but when the noticeable significant main effect of intervention on offspring outcomes, if it's attenuated, we'll presume that there's some variability in who it's attenuated for and try to uncover, is it postnatal parenting that makes a big difference in terms of which effects are sustained for whom? Is it something around the level of stress pre or postnatally that enables some women to maintain that optimized state versus others and their babies likewise?
Thank you. Maria Chow says, thank you for an extraordinary presentation, such powerful findings. Would love to hear your thoughts on translating to practice and broader community impacts. Is the study intervention offered on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so what's happening right now is we still have people who are asking for the manual. I know that we have plans at the Center for Mindfulness at UC San Diego to start training some of the trainers. I believe Danielle Rubinoff is putting together a proposal for a grant to do virtual delivery of a version of the intervention. And that will be wonderful if we can get that out there. And I do think that the next step is going to be a mechanism/randomized trial. But I also think that there are enough solid data between the earlier studies and this one on reduction of distress and enough promise on the infants that we could begin to disseminate this even before a randomized control trial and mechanistic. There was some great work done by Larissa Duncan and Nancy Bardicke, who were working to incorporate a mindfulness training into centering pregnancy, which is where women are already getting group treatment for pregnancy and including some of these elements. So that could be another possibility, is to, I'm not 100% sure what all the outcomes were that they saw, but to somehow incorporate it into centering pregnancy would be another option.
Great, thank you. Nikki, you mentioned funding has ended for the seed studies. Does that mean you've completed following the offspring?
Well, I continue to fund visits, remote visits with discretionary money, and Danielle pitched in some money the last visit. And so we're keeping it alive, but we considered going for renewal and the pandemic hit. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these women were enrolled just before the big recession in the Bay Area, and more than half moved away within 3 years postnatally. And so it's incredibly hard to follow them physically. And so we're kind of limited to remote visits, which don't have the same pizzazz and an NIH renewal in terms of getting those metabolic markers or physical growth outcomes or behavioral task things. And so it's unfortunate, but I would say the majority live beyond 2-hour radius. In fact, many are 4 to 5 hours away.
I also wanted to mention that, you know, in the end, the most optimized intervention, remember, this was an iterative process of developing an intervention, and the very last couple of waves, we were actually bringing grocery bags of food to people because we recognized that over the course of the intervention, we were giving these nutritional recommendations. We already knew that there was a lot of food insecurity and people were living in food deserts, but I don't think we knew quite how difficult it would be. And so adding that food was a huge thing. And so it would be wonderful. Nikki and I and Alyssa have all talked about, number one, stretching the intervention across the childbirth event. So that, and the women asked for that, you know, if we could have 8 weeks pre and then 4 weeks post, and then, you know, quarterly boosters or even annual boosters of mindfulness training. And we know now to include the food is such a huge part of what might actually kind of tip it over the edge into actual effects on obesity. And we're happy with the effects that we saw, and we're thrilled with the baby effects. I mean, that's just a huge, huge thing. But we'd still like to see it go even further. So I'd love to see that optimized intervention tested in a new trial, and follow some dissemination and implementation and practice-based research. Because the last thing I'll say is, you guys have done clinical trials, very, very, very difficult recruitment, getting the women in the room, very difficult. So we've got to do a better job of going to where they are and bringing everything we need, bringing food and, you know, all of that stuff. So I would love to do a new study with all that involved.
So we welcome funders. Tell your friends.
Thank you so much. So amazing to hear about your findings, and also how your sort of like future plans for this really important trailblazing research. I have a quick sort of late breaking announcement, which is that our next research seminar is going to be a non-standard date. It's next Thursday, May 4th. Naya Jones is going to be presenting. Her talk title is Rerooted: Critical Reflections on the Study and Practice of Black Botanical Medicine. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Nikki and Cassie. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Thanks, Cassie, for leading the charge with the women.
Thank you, Nikki.
Have a wonderful day. Thanks for all the work you do at Osher, everyone. You're a big part of our inspiration.